On the morning of October 22nd, 2001, police got a call about a house on Middle Lane in East Hampton. This is one of the best addresses in town, the kind of street where every home costs millions and everyone knows everyone else's business, even if they pretend not to. When the cops arrived, they found something that didn't belong in this picture-perfect neighborhood. Ted Ammon, a 52-year-old Wall Street financier, was dead. And this wasn't some quiet passing in his sleep. This wasn't a heart attack or an accident. Someone had beaten him to death in his own home. The violence was so extreme, so brutal, that even experienced detectives who had seen plenty of crime scenes were shocked by what they found. This wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. Whoever did this didn't stumble into the wrong house looking for jewelry to steal. This was personal. Very, very personal. Are you ready for the darkest stories Britain has to offer? Introducing our new book, Unreal True Crime, British edition. 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, or grab your instant PDF download from our website. Links are in the description below. Don't miss out. Get your copy today. And now, let's continue with today's case. Ted Ammon was a Wall Street guy through and through. He came up during the 1980s, that crazy era when corporate raiders were buying and selling entire companies like they were baseball cards. You might have heard of the RJR Nabisco deal, the one they made a movie about called Barbarians at the Gate. Well, Ted was connected to that world. He worked with firms like Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, learning from the masters how the biggest players made their fortunes. And Ted? He was good at it. Really, really good. He made millions, then tens of millions. He bought houses in Manhattan and the Hamptons. He collected art that would make museum curators jealous. He drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. But here's the thing about Ted. Money alone wasn't enough for him. He wanted to be somebody. He wanted respect, not just from other finance guys, but from the people who mattered in New York society. So he got involved in the arts. He became chairman of jazz at Lincoln Center, which is basically one of the most prestigious cultural positions you can have in New York City. Suddenly, Ted wasn't just a finance guy counting his money. He was at gallery openings and charity galas, rubbing shoulders with artists and celebrities and politicians. He had made it to the top. He was living the dream that most people can only imagine. In 1986, Ted married a woman named Generosa. She was beautiful, artistic, with this intense energy that drew people to her. But she'd had a rough start in life. Her mom died when she was young, and she grew up bouncing around without the kind of stability most kids take for granted. That kind of childhood leaves marks on a person. It makes you hungry for security. It makes you terrified of losing what you have. When Generosa met Ted, she finally had a chance at the secure, beautiful life she'd always wanted. And together, they built something that looked absolutely perfect from the outside. Their homes were featured in magazines. Their parties were legendary. They were that couple, you know? The ones everyone wants to be. The ones everyone envies. In 1992, they flew all the way to Ukraine and adopted twins, a boy named Greg and a girl named Alexa. Now the picture was complete. Successful husband, beautiful wife, adorable kids, houses that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Ted and Generosa had it all. They had achieved the American dream in its most extravagant form. But here's what nobody tells you about fairy tales. They're not real. And behind the perfect photos and the magazine spreads, behind the glamorous parties and the designer clothes, Ted and Generosa's marriage was falling apart. The cracks were spreading. And soon, those cracks would become chasms that would swallow them both. By 2001, Ted and Generosa weren't just getting divorced. They were at war. And I don't mean they were arguing about who gets the good china. This was ugly. This was nasty. This was two people who had once promised to love each other forever, now trying to completely destroy each other. When you're dealing with tens of millions of dollars and two kids caught in the middle, that war can get really, really ugly. Every decision becomes a battle. Every conversation goes through lawyers. Every day is another chance to hurt the person you used to love. Ted handled the divorce the same way he handled everything else in his life. Like a business deal. He hired the best lawyers money could buy. He had his accountants go through every number, every asset, every bank account. He approached the whole thing like a problem that could be solved with the right strategy and enough preparation. And honestly, he was confident. He'd won in business his whole life. Why would this be any different? Generosa saw things completely differently. For her, this wasn't about numbers on a spreadsheet or legal strategies. This was about survival. Remember, she grew up without security. She'd spent years building this life, this identity as a society wife and mother. She had the houses, the parties, the social standing. And now Ted was threatening to take it all away from her. Her status, her money, her access to her kids. Everything she had worked for, everything she was, hung in the balance. She started to get paranoid. Maybe she had good reasons, maybe she didn't. But she became absolutely convinced that Ted was spying on her, tracking her every move, building a case to take the children away forever. She thought he had hidden cameras in the house. She thought he was monitoring her phone calls. She thought he had hired people to follow her everywhere she went. These fears consumed her. She couldn't think about anything else. They became her whole reality. And then, right in the middle of all this chaos, when Generosa was at her most vulnerable, a new man walked into her life. His name was Danny Pelosi, and he couldn't have been more different from Ted Ammon if he'd tried. Danny was an electrician from Long Island, not the fancy part of Long Island where the rich people live, the regular part where working people raise their families and worry about paying their bills. He was hired to do some renovation work on one of the Ammon properties, just another contractor in work boots and a tool belt showing up to fix the wiring. Danny was charming, funny, and completely out of place in the world of the Hamptons elite. He told jokes. He made people laugh. He had this way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. And Generosa, who was feeling scared and alone and desperate, who was watching her marriage fall apart and her whole life crumble, fell for it. She fell hard. They started an affair. And what began as maybe just a distraction, just a way to feel something other than fear and anger, quickly became something more. Something intense, something that would change everything. Danny moved fast, really, really fast. Before long, this electrician who used to show up in a beat-up work van was staying in mansions. He was driving luxury cars that cost more than he used to make in a year. He was wearing designer clothes and eating at fancy restaurants. The transformation was unbelievable. People noticed. Of course they noticed. In the Hamptons, everybody notices everything, even if they pretend they don't. Here was this working-class guy from the wrong side of Long Island suddenly living like a millionaire. People whispered, people gossiped, but Danny didn't seem to care. Neither did Generosa. They were in their own world. The prosecutors would later say that Danny saw an opportunity and grabbed it with both hands. A rich, vulnerable woman in the middle of a nasty divorce? A woman who stood to inherit a massive fortune if only her husband weren't in the picture? For a guy like Danny, it must have looked like winning the lottery. The only question was whether he'd be willing to do what it took to cash in. October 20th, 2001. A Saturday. Ted Ammon drove out to his house in East Hampton for the weekend, just like he'd done hundreds of times before. The divorce was almost finished. After months of fighting, months of lawyers and depositions and bitter negotiations, the end was finally in sight. In a few more days, maybe a week at most, the papers would be signed. He'd kept most of his money. He'd secured his right to see his kids. As far as Ted was concerned, he'd won. He probably felt pretty good that night. The nightmare was almost over. He could finally move on with his life, start fresh, put all the ugliness behind him. He had dinner. He watched some TV. He went to bed in his beautiful house in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in America. He had no idea it would be his last night alive. We'll never know exactly what happened in that house during the early hours of October 21st. The only person who knows for certain is the killer, and they're not talking. What we do know is that sometime that night or early the next morning, someone got inside, someone who knew the house, someone who knew how to get past the alarm system without triggering it, someone who came with a very specific purpose in mind. Ted Ammon was beaten to death. The attack was brutal, violent, and personal. This wasn't a quick killing. Whoever did this wanted Ted to suffer. They hit him again and again with some kind of blunt object, something heavy enough to do terrible damage. By the time it was over, Ted didn't stand a chance. The weapon was never found. Here's what made investigators immediately suspicious. There was no sign of forced entry, no smashed windows, no kicked-in doors, no broken locks. The alarm system had been dealt with by someone who knew how it worked, someone who had the codes or had figured them out. This wasn't some random burglar who got surprised by a homeowner. This was planned. This was calculated. And this was done by someone who had access to that house. Ted Ammon, the man who had spent his whole life in control, who had always found a way to win, who had always had the answers, had been completely powerless to stop whoever did this. All his money, all his success, all his careful planning, none of it mattered in the end. In his own home, in his own bedroom, he was just as vulnerable as anyone else. When the news broke, it was everywhere. A Wall Street millionaire murdered in his Hamptons mansion? Are you kidding? The tabloids went absolutely crazy. This had everything: money, murder, mystery. Everyone wanted to know who did it. And pretty quickly, people started looking at the obvious suspects, Generosa and her new boyfriend. But then Generosa did something that shocked absolutely everyone who was paying attention. 3 months after Ted was murdered, 3 months, the investigation was still going on. The police hadn't arrested anyone yet, but everyone knew they were looking hard at Generosa and Danny. Suspicion was swirling around them like a hurricane. And in the middle of all that, Generosa married Danny Pelosi. The electrician who'd been working on her house just a year earlier was now her husband. Let that sink in for a second. Her husband just got murdered in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. The cops are clearly looking at people close to her. Everyone suspects her boyfriend might have done it. And she marries him? 3 months later? It was either incredibly bold or incredibly stupid. Maybe both. But to the prosecutors building their case, this was basically a flashing neon sign. In their eyes, Generosa and Danny had conspired to kill Ted so they could have his money. And now, barely 3 months later, they were making it official. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Building a murder case takes time, especially when you don't have a smoking gun. The police had their suspicions about Danny Pelosi from the very beginning, but suspicions aren't enough to convict someone. You need evidence. You need a case that will hold up in court. And that takes patience. It took more than 2 years. In March 2004, police finally arrested Danny Pelosi and charged him with second-degree murder. The trial that followed would be one of the most talked-about cases in years. It was all over the news, all over the tabloids, all over the TV. Everyone had an opinion about what really happened. The case had everything people love in a true crime story: money, sex, class warfare. A working-class guy accused of killing a millionaire so he could steal his lifestyle. The courtroom was packed every single day. Reporters fought for seats. The newspapers couldn't print stories fast enough. The prosecution laid out their case piece by piece, like building a wall one brick at a time. They admitted right up front that they didn't have a murder weapon. They didn't have DNA evidence. They didn't have fingerprints placing Danny at the scene that night. What they had was something else. They had motive. Mountains of motive. Think about it from Danny's perspective, they told the jury. Here's a guy who's been working with his hands his whole life, scraping by, probably never imagining he'd live in anything fancier than a regular house in a regular neighborhood. And suddenly, because of his relationship with Generosa, he's living in mansions. He's driving cars that cost more than he used to make in a year. He's eating at restaurants where the bill for dinner is more than his old monthly rent. But there's a problem. If the divorce goes through the way it's supposed to, Generosa gets a settlement. A nice chunk of money, sure. Enough to live comfortably. But nothing compared to what she'd get if Ted died before the papers were signed. If Ted dies while they're still technically married, Generosa inherits everything: the houses, the art, the investments, all of it. And Danny, as her husband, gets to enjoy that fortune right alongside her. The math was simple. Ted alive meant a nice payout. Ted dead meant hitting the jackpot. The defense fought back hard. They were smart lawyers, and they knew exactly where the prosecution's case was weak. Where's the evidence, they kept asking. Where's the weapon? Where's the DNA? All you have is a theory, a story that sounds good, but doesn't actually prove anything. They argued that Danny was being prosecuted not because of what he did, but because of who he was. A working-class outsider who didn't fit in with the Hamptons crowd. An easy target. But the jury didn't buy it. After weeks of testimony, after hearing from dozens of witnesses, after looking at all the evidence from every angle, they came back with their verdict. In December 2004, they found Danny Pelosi guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The electrician who had dreamed of living like a king would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Danny has always said he didn't do it. From the day he was arrested to today, he's insisted he's innocent. In interviews from prison, he's pointed fingers at other people, including Generosa herself. He says he was set up, that the real killer is still walking around free. Maybe he's telling the truth, maybe he's not. But the jury heard all the evidence and made their decision. In the eyes of the law, Danny Pelosi murdered Ted Ammon for money, and he's paying for it with his freedom. Here's the thing about this story that really gets to me. There are no winners, not a single one. Everyone lost something. Some people lost everything. Generosa Ammon never saw Danny's trial. She never saw him get convicted. In August 2003, while Danny was still waiting to even be charged, she died of breast cancer. She was only 51 years old. Whatever secrets she had about that night in October 2001, whatever she knew or didn't know about what really happened, She took them to her grave. Her death made everything even messier, if you can believe it. Ted hadn't updated his will before he was killed. He probably figured he'd do it after the divorce was finalized, when he knew exactly what he had and who should get it. But he never got that chance. So when Generosa died, there was chaos. Lawyers fighting over money, banks arguing about who controlled what, legal battles that dragged on for years while the lawyers got rich and everyone else waited. And caught in the middle of all of it, Greg and Alexa, the twins, the kids who had been adopted from Ukraine when they were babies, brought to America with so much hope for their future. First, they lost their father to murder. Then they lost their mother to cancer. And then, while they were still trying to figure out how to deal with losing both parents, they had to watch as adults fought over who would raise them and who would control their money. These weren't characters in a TV show. They were real kids who lost both their parents before they were even teenagers. Everything that happened, the murder, the trial, the tabloid headlines, all of it, that was their lives. And they have to carry that weight every single day. Today, the Hamptons look exactly the same as they always did. The big houses are still there, hiding behind their hedges. Rich people still come out for the summer, throw their parties, drink their expensive wine, and believe they're safe behind their gates and alarm systems. Life goes on. The seasons change. New scandals replace old ones. The house where Ted Ammon died has been sold and fixed up. New owners trying to escape the shadow of what happened there. Trying to make it just another beautiful house on a beautiful street. But some shadows don't go away so easily. Some stains don't wash out. Danny Pelosi is still in prison today. He's eligible for parole eventually, but for now, he's serving his time. Still telling anyone who'll listen that he didn't do it. Still insisting he's innocent. Maybe someday he'll get out. Maybe he won't. The system has spoken. So, what are we supposed to take away from this story? What's the lesson here? Maybe it's that money can't protect you from everything. Ted Ammon had all the success anyone could want. He had the houses, the cars, the status, the beautiful family, everything that's supposed to make you happy and keep you safe. And none of it mattered when someone decided he had to die. Maybe it's that people are capable of terrible things when love and money get twisted up together. When desperation meets opportunity. When someone sees a chance to change their whole life and decides they're willing to do whatever it takes to grab it. Or maybe the lesson is simpler than that. Behind every headline, every sensational story, every true crime documentary you watch late at night, there are real people, real victims who had families and dreams and plans for the future, real children who have to grow up carrying wounds that might never fully heal. Ted Ammon's murder case is officially closed. A man was convicted and sent to prison. Justice, at least as the legal system defines it, was served. But the questions this case raises don't have easy answers. Questions about wealth and marriage, about love and betrayal, about what people will do when they think nobody is watching. In the end, paradise wasn't just shattered. It was revealed to be an illusion. The perfect life was never perfect. The safety was never real. And some prices, once paid, can never be undone. A property surrounded by security cameras, a driveway sensor that chimed with every approach, 4 German shepherds stationed like sentries around the perimeter, multiple firearms within arm's reach of both adults who lived there. This was a home designed to keep danger out, a fortress in the Ohio countryside, built layer by layer by a man who believed in self-reliance and preparation. And yet, inside that bedroom, a man lay motionless, a point-blank wound to the back of his head. His wife on the phone with 911, screaming for help, her voice cracking with desperation as she tried to explain what had happened. The cameras had recorded nothing. The dogs hadn't barked. The sensors hadn't triggered. A revolver sat on the kitchen floor, one round fired, the chamber warm. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no evidence that anyone had come or gone in the night. If no one had broken in, then how did this happen? And if someone did break in, how did they manage to bypass everything without leaving a single trace? For investigators arriving at the scene that morning, these questions would become an obsession that consumed years of their careers. Because in the investigation that followed, the answer they found wasn't one anyone wanted to believe. The truth, as they came to see it, was darker and more disturbing than any intruder theory could ever be. Are you ready for the darkest stories Britain has to offer? Introducing our new book, Unreal True Crime, British edition. 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, or grab your instant PDF download from our website. Links are in the description below. Don't miss out. Get your copy today. And now, let's continue with today's case. Jeremy Scott Simcoe came into the world on July 7, 1973, in Lorain, Ohio, a small city on the shores of Lake Erie where blue-collar values ran deep and neighbors still knew each other by name. The town had a working-class heartbeat, shaped by steel mills and shipyards, by men who came home tired and women who held families together through difficult times. He grew up in Sheffield Township, surrounded by dense woodlands and the kind of silence that makes you notice every rustling leaf. From an early age, Jeremy was drawn to the outdoors. While other kids spent summers glued to television screens, he was out exploring, climbing, learning to read the natural world around him. At Clearview High School, he found his competitive outlet on the wrestling mat. He wrestled varsity at the 135-pound weight class. Wrestling taught him discipline and how to push through exhaustion when every muscle screamed to quit. Those who knew him then remember a young man with intensity in his eyes, competitive, focused, unwilling to settle for second place. After graduating in 1991, Jeremy enrolled at Hocking Technical College in Nelsonville, where he studied arboriculture, the cultivation and management of trees. It was a path that combined his love of nature with practical skills. He started working for established companies, Edwards Tree Service first, then Davy Tree Service. These jobs were his education beyond the classroom. He studied the business from every angle, how things were run, what worked, and what didn't. In 1997, at just 24 years old, he founded Simcoe Tree Service. Building a business from nothing is never easy. But Jeremy attacked it with the same determination he'd brought to the wrestling mat. He was meticulous about doing things right, every cut precise, every cleanup thorough. He would climb trees that made other arborists nervous, moving through branches 60 feet above the ground with artistic confidence. Within a few years, Simcoe Tree Service had built a reputation as one of the premier operations in Lorain County. The business that had started with one man and a chainsaw grew into something substantial: trucks, equipment, employees, an expanding client list. But there were two sides to this coin. On job sites, Jeremy could be loud, strict, demanding. He expected perfection from his crews and didn't soften his criticism when they fell short. Some described him as a hothead, quick to frustration, unafraid of confrontation. His high standards made sense in dangerous work, but they also made enemies. Not everyone appreciated his management style. Away from work, a different Jeremy emerged. Friends and family described him as an avid naturalist who could spend hours identifying plants, tracking animals, simply being present in the wilderness. He loved campfires and cooking outdoors. He was a natural teacher, patient in ways that surprised people who knew his workplace reputation. He invested heavily in his nieces and nephews. He taught them to swim, to hunt safely, to drive on back roads. He passed down the practical knowledge that had shaped his own childhood. His family was close-knit. His mother, Rose Mager; his father, Robert J. Simcoe; his sisters, Melanie and Hillary; his paternal grandmother, Mary Simcoe. His in-laws, Judy and Rolando Maldonado, had welcomed him into their family when he married their daughter. That daughter was Julene. Jeremy and Julene had built something together beyond just a marriage. They were business partners as well as spouses, running Simcoe Tree Service side by side. She handled the administrative work, scheduling, billing, paperwork. He handled the physical work, climbing, cutting, the skilled labor that paid the bills. People who knew them often described them as best friends. They took long hikes together with their 4 German shepherds, the dogs that would later become central to understanding what happened. The Simcoe property on North Ridge Road in Brownhelm Township wasn't just a home, it was a compound. A gate blocked the driveway entrance. Even if someone got through, a driveway sensor would trigger a loud tone inside the house. The home had door sensors on every first-floor entrance. Open any door, and 3 rapid beeps would sound throughout the house. A speaker near the 3rd-floor loft ensured that even someone sleeping upstairs would hear the alert. Security cameras covered the front and back, with views of the driveway and barn. The footage was always recording. And then there were the dogs. 4 German shepherds, large, alert, and described by visitors as vicious-looking. At night, they were chained around the perimeter, positioned to detect anyone approaching. Living alarms with teeth. Inside, firearms were never far away. Both Jeremy and Julene had concealed carry permits. A 9mm was kept in the bedroom. A .357 Magnum often sat in a holster inside a first-floor china cabinet. Jeremy lived in a rural area where police response times could stretch long. He'd built his security system piece by piece, creating layers of protection that would warn him of any threat long before it reached his bedroom. He had prepared for every possible scenario. Every scenario except one. Tuesday, November 17th, 2009. According to later accounts, it was an ordinary day at the Simcoe household. Julene spent part of the afternoon canning pumpkins. The couple watched television in the evening. Nothing remarkable. Around 10 p.m., Jeremy went outside to secure the dogs for the night. The security cameras recorded this, the last normal footage they would capture. When he came back inside, the kitchen door was locked. The security system was active. The cameras were rolling. Jeremy went to bed in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. Julene would later say she didn't join him there. She told investigators she went to the 3rd-floor loft to sleep on the couch. Her explanations varied. It was too hot. Jeremy had pushed her out of bed. His snoring was unbearable. The explanations changed depending on when she was asked. This inconsistency would later become a focus of investigation, but everyone agreed. In the hours that followed, the cameras recorded nothing unusual. The driveway sensor remained silent. The door sensors didn't chime. The four German shepherds didn't bark. The fortress held its breath. Until it didn't. At approximately 6 a.m. on Wednesday, November 18, 2009, a gunshot rang out inside the Simcoe home. Jeremy Simcoe was shot in the back of the head at point-blank range while lying in his bed. The barrel of the weapon had been so close to his skull that investigators would later describe it as a near-contact wound. He likely never knew what was happening. He never had a chance to fight back, to reach for the 9mm beside his bed, to use any of the skills or preparation that had defined his approach to life. He was killed in his sleep, in his own bed, in the fortress he had built to protect himself. Minutes later, Julene Simcoe called 911. Her voice was frantic, desperate, the kind of raw panic that makes dispatchers lean forward and type faster. She told the operator that someone had broken in, that her husband had been shot, that she needed help immediately. She stayed on the line following instructions, attempting CPR on a man who was already beyond saving. When officers arrived, they found Julene still on the phone, still talking to dispatchers. She explained what had happened, or what she said had happened. She had been sleeping on the third-floor loft couch when she heard a loud noise. At first, she thought it might be Jeremy firing at an animal from the bedroom window, something he'd done before when wildlife threatened their property or dogs. But something felt wrong. She went downstairs to check on him. In the darkness, she felt blood. And then she heard another noise somewhere else in the house. Footsteps, maybe, or a door. She grabbed the 9mm from the bedroom, using the glow from an alarm clock to disengage the safety, and fired 2 shots into the hallway. Then she found Jeremy's phone and called 911. A .357 Magnum revolver lay on the kitchen floor. 1 round had been fired. The 2 hallway shots had come from the bedroom 9mm that Julene claimed to have fired. But here's where the case took its first strange turn. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere. The doors and windows were locked, all except the kitchen door, which officers found standing open when they arrived. The screen door was closed, but unlocked. The security cameras had recorded nothing after Jeremy secured the dogs at 10 p.m. No approaching vehicle. No figure moving through the darkness. No shadow, no silhouette, nothing at all. The driveway sensor hadn't triggered. The dogs hadn't barked. 4 German shepherds, positioned specifically to alert their owners to intruders, had remained silent throughout whatever happened in that house. Officers searching the property found no evidence that anyone had entered from outside. No footprints leading to the house, at least none that could be attributed to a stranger. No DNA from an unknown source. Nothing stolen. Nothing disturbed beyond what the crime itself had caused. If a killer had broken in, they had done so without leaving a single trace. They had bypassed a locked gate, a driveway sensor, 4 aggressive dogs, multiple cameras, and locked doors. They had navigated a dark, unfamiliar house, found and retrieved a weapon from a china cabinet, located the bedroom, shot a sleeping man from inches away while his armed wife was somewhere unknown in the building, placed the gun carefully on the kitchen floor without dropping it or leaving marks, and disappeared into the night. All without waking anyone. All without the dogs making a sound. Investigators looked at this scenario and struggled to believe it could be true. But if not an intruder, then who? As investigators dug deeper into the evidence, small inconsistencies began to surface like cracks in a foundation. There was the matter of Julene's changing explanations for why she slept on the third-floor couch instead of in bed with her husband. Temperature, snoring, being pushed out, each version slightly different from the last, none of them quite fitting together into a coherent picture. There was the .357 Magnum on the kitchen floor. Officers noted that the gun showed no impact marks, no dents or scratches that would suggest it had been dropped by someone fleeing in panic. It looked, to their trained eyes, like it had been placed there deliberately, carefully set down rather than abandoned in haste. The china cabinet where the gun was normally stored was found slightly ajar, the empty holster visible inside like an accusation. And then there was what happened at the hospital. A nurse who was present when Julene arrived would later testify about something that stopped her cold. According to the nurse, Julene initially said, "I shot my husband." Then, almost immediately, she corrected herself. "Someone shot my husband." A slip of the tongue? Trauma-induced confusion? The kind of mistake anyone might make in the worst moments of their life? Or something more revealing, a truth that slipped out before the careful story could be maintained? Investigators also examined the couple's financial situation, looking for any pressure that might constitute motive. They learned that Jeremy and Julene had been trying to secure a bank loan to purchase adjacent land, an expansion of their property that would have required significant capital. The loan had recently been denied. Julene had mentioned moving the 9mm from its usual spot because of an appraisal related to the loan application. But when investigators contacted the bank, representatives said no appraisal had been scheduled. Another inconsistency. Another detail that didn't quite add up. And there was one more digital breadcrumb that caught investigators' attention. On the evening before Jeremy's death, just hours before the shooting, someone had accessed an online obituary for Julene's father. When asked about this, Julene denied doing it and couldn't explain why anyone in the household would have visited that page on that particular night. A strange coincidence? Or something more deliberate? A moment of reflection before irreversible action? None of these details proved anything on their own, but together, they painted a picture that made investigators deeply uncomfortable with the intruder narrative. The investigation would span years, becoming an obsession for detectives who couldn't let the case go. Initially, they followed every possible lead with open minds. A neighbor had reported seeing an unusual person walking near a church in the days before the shooting. Jeremy had apparently noticed this too. Someone had texted him about it because he was known as a sort of neighborhood watchman, always alert to anything out of place in the community. Another tip pointed to a neighbor identified in court records only as JB. Investigators interviewed him multiple times over the years, examined his possible connection to the case, tracked his movements, scrutinized his alibi. Eventually, they excluded him as a suspect. He died before the case ever went to trial, taking whatever knowledge he might have had with him. There were rumors of a drug deal gone wrong, the kind of speculation that follows any unexplained death in rural America, where people search for explanations that make sense of senseless violence. Investigators looked into it thoroughly and found nothing substantive. No evidence of drug involvement, no suspicious contacts, no financial trail suggesting illicit activity. But even as alternative theories fizzled one by one, the circumstantial evidence against Julene continued to accumulate like snow in winter. Forensic experts examined the bullet jacket fragments recovered from the bedroom. The analysis was consistent with the rounds having been fired from the .357 Magnum found on the kitchen floor. The bullet itself was never recovered. It had fragmented upon impact with Jeremy's skull, but the weapon analysis pointed strongly to that specific gun as the murder weapon. The gun showed no conclusive biological evidence tying it to the shooter. No fingerprints that could be definitively matched. No DNA under the grip. But it also showed nothing tying it to any mysterious intruder. No foreign DNA. No evidence of anyone else's presence. The black gloves found outside the house contained DNA from both Jeremy and Julene, consistent with gloves that either of them might have worn while working outside, not proof of any intruder. Footprints in the nearby woods had no identifying characteristics that could help or hurt either theory. The camera footage showed nothing. The four alert German shepherds had made no sound during the critical window when Jeremy was killed. Yet when police arrived with sirens and lights, dash cam footage confirmed the dogs barked immediately and aggressively, exactly as guard dogs should. They reacted to strangers. They just hadn't reacted to anyone that night. In 2013, investigators interviewed Julene again, pressing her on the inconsistencies in her story. 4 years had passed since Jeremy's death, but the case remained open, unsolved, haunting everyone who had worked on it. And in October 2014, nearly 5 years after that November morning, a Lorain County grand jury returned an indictment. Julene Simcoe was charged with murder in the death of her husband. She turned herself in and was released on a $500,000 bond, returning home to wait for the trial that would determine the rest of her life. The case went to trial in September 2017, 8 years after Jeremy Simcoe died in his bed. Julene made an unusual decision. She waived her right to a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial. This meant that Judge Mark Betleski alone would weigh the evidence and determine her guilt or innocence. No 12 citizens deliberating. No unanimous verdict required. Just one man, trained in law, deciding whether the state had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense called no witnesses. Their entire strategy rested on challenging the prosecution's case, arguing that circumstantial evidence, no matter how suggestive, wasn't enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There was no murder weapon conclusively tied to Julene, no confession, no eyewitness who saw her pull the trigger, just a web of suspicious circumstances and an alternative scenario that seemed implausible but couldn't be completely disproven. The prosecution laid out their theory methodically, building their case brick by brick. An unknown intruder, they argued, would have had to accomplish something virtually impossible. This hypothetical killer would have had to bypass the locked gate, avoid triggering the driveway sensor, pass 4 German shepherds without a single bark, enter through a door without forcing it, meaning either picking a lock or having a key, navigate an unfamiliar house in complete darkness, find and retrieve a weapon from a china cabinet without knowing it was there, locate the master bedroom, execute a sleeping man at point-blank range while his armed wife was somewhere unknown in the building, possibly awake, possibly armed, certainly dangerous if discovered. Then this intruder would have had to place the gun carefully on the kitchen floor rather than dropping it in flight. Exit the house, escape the property. Leave no DNA, no fingerprints, no footprints, no camera footage, no physical evidence of any kind. And this intruder would have done all of this without stealing anything. Not the other guns, not any cash, not any valuables, nothing. The alternative explanation, prosecutors argued, required far fewer leaps of logic. On October 20th, 2017, Judge Betleski delivered his verdict: guilty. In his ruling, the judge acknowledged something unusual. The prosecution hadn't sufficiently proven motive. Why would Julene kill her husband? The financial stress theory was incomplete. Denied loans create frustration, not typically murder. The marriage dynamics were open to interpretation. Investigators had found certain intimate materials in the home that suggested an unconventional relationship dynamic, but Julene insisted everything was consensual and nothing proved otherwise. The why remained murky, even at the end of the trial. But motive, Judge Betleski noted, isn't a required element for conviction in Ohio. Prosecutors don't have to prove why someone committed murder, only that they did commit it, beyond a reasonable doubt. Looking at the universe of possible explanations, a random stranger, a hired assassin, or the spouse sleeping one floor away, the judge concluded that only one scenario made logical sense given all the evidence. On October 27, 2017, Julene Simcoe was sentenced to 28 years to life in prison for the murder of her husband. She appealed, arguing that the evidence was insufficient to support the conviction. Her attorneys maintained that reasonable doubt existed, that the intruder theory, however unlikely, couldn't be completely eliminated. In April 2021, the Ohio Ninth District Court of Appeals affirmed the verdict. The justices found no reversible error. The conviction stands. Today, if you drive along Northridge Road in Brownhelm Township, you might pass the property without a second glance. Just another rural home among many. Trees that someone else tends now. A driveway that no longer leads to a fortress. The ordinary architecture of what was once an extraordinary life. But for those who knew Jeremy Simcoe, the loss still reverberates through the years like ripples on still water. His family remembers a man who taught his nieces and nephews to swim in summer lakes, to hunt responsibly in autumn woods, to drive carefully on backcountry roads. Who could identify trees at a glance and climb them with the confidence of someone born for that specific purpose? Who built a business from nothing through sheer will and meticulous attention to detail? Jeremy Simcoe had prepared for every possible danger, but sometimes the threat doesn't come from outside the walls. Sometimes the person we trust most completely is the one we should have feared. And sometimes the fortresses we build aren't meant to protect us from the world. They're meant to hide what happens within. If this case resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who appreciates true crime that respects both the facts and the lives behind them. It's through your support that we can continue telling these stories, not for sensationalism, but for understanding. Because remembering the people behind the cases, honoring who they were before tragedy found them, is how we keep their memory alive. The water was still that morning. February 13th, 2018. Lake Coeur d'Alene stretched out under a pale winter sky, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air like smoke. A small boat drifted near the shore, carrying a woman who was about to make a phone call that would unravel everything. 2 hours. That's how long she waited. 2 hours before dialing 911. 2 hours with the lake around her, silent and vast. 2 hours to think, to decide, to prepare what she would say. Her husband was no longer in the boat. The sunrise they had come to watch was long gone by the time help arrived. And when rescuers reached the scene, they found a woman with a bloody nose, shivering, telling a story about a man who had simply fallen into the water. A story about a romantic morning gone wrong. A story that, piece by piece, would fall apart. What really happened on that boat? Why the delay? And why did nothing about this woman's story quite add up? Are you ready for the darkest stories Britain has to offer? Introducing our new book, Unreal True Crime, British Edition. 35 shocking true murder cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Available now on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, or grab your instant PDF download from our website. Links are in the description below. Don't miss out. Get your copy today. And now, let's continue with today's case. Larry Eisenberg was born in Idaho in 1950, a true local who spent his entire life in the state. He grew up surrounded by forests and lakes, the kind of landscape that would shape his entire life. From an early age, he understood the value of hard work, a principle he would carry with him every single day until his last. He attended the University of Idaho, where he earned a degree in forestry. It was the natural choice for someone who had grown up watching the timber industry pulse through his community. After graduation, Larry built a solid career in the lumber business, eventually rising to become an executive in the industry. Colleagues knew him as tough, disciplined, and relentlessly frugal. He wasn't the type to waste money, and he wasn't the type to tolerate laziness. In 1974, Larry married his first wife. Together they had 2 children, a daughter named Jessica and a son named Dean. He raised them with the same principles that guided his own life: work hard, stay honest, be a straight arrow. His kids remember him saying things like that all the time, drilling into them the importance of integrity and effort. The marriage lasted until the children were grown, and then, like many long unions, it quietly came to an end. Larry and Lori's paths crossed through the Coeur d'Alene Chamber of Commerce, where both were active members of the local business community. Some accounts suggest she was hired as his secretary while he was still married, and that their relationship began after both their marriages had ended. Either way, by the time they became a couple, they presented themselves as 2 people embarking on a new chapter together. Lori Barnes was born in 1953 into circumstances far different from Larry's steady Idaho upbringing. She grew up in a sect of the LDS Church, and her childhood was marked by serious poverty. There were periods when her family had so little that they squatted in empty farmhouses, moving from place to place, surviving on whatever they could find. Despite these beginnings, or perhaps because of them, Lori developed a personality that drew people in. She had a smile that seemed genuine and a giddy laugh that put others at ease. By the time she reached adulthood, she had learned how to make people like her, how to present a version of herself that inspired trust. At 19, in 1973, she married Stephen Barnes. Over the following years, they had 6 daughters together. Lori threw herself into motherhood and, by all outward appearances, created a stable home. Her daughter Amber would later describe their early family life as perfect: church every Sunday, lessons about living right, making good choices, getting good grades, doing chores. The structure that Lori had lacked in her own childhood, she seemed determined to build for her children. The marriage to Stephen lasted over 2 decades before ending in 1996. At 43 years old, Lori found herself a single mother, and she made a significant decision. She would start over in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. In this new city, Lori reinvented herself. She became deeply involved in community work, eventually earning the title of Volunteer of the Year from the Coeur d'Alene Chamber of Commerce. She was the kind of person who showed up at events, who remembered names, who made connections. Eventually, she rose to become the executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, a nonprofit organization tied to federal housing funds. It was a position of trust, a role that gave her access to significant resources meant to help those in need. To the outside world, Lori Barnes had overcome her difficult beginnings and become a pillar of her community. When Lori and Larry married, they brought together a blended family of 8 children, Larry's 2 and Lori's 6, along with 15 grandchildren and eventually a great-grandchild. It was a large, sprawling clan, and the couple embraced it fully. They owned a secluded cabin that they lovingly called Our Paradise, a place where the whole family would gather for holidays and celebrations. From the outside, the marriage looked like a fairy tale. Dean Eisenberg would later describe it as absolutely perfect. Friends used the word soulmates. A colleague who knew them both said Larry trusted Lori completely, without reservation. They traveled together constantly, visiting grandchildren, taking trips, building what appeared to be an ideal retirement. Lori's daughter, Chrislyn, would later recall how happy her mother seemed with Larry, noting the way he looked at Lori with genuine admiration. The stepchildren on both sides appeared to get along. Larry, despite being a tough and frugal man, had a warmth that extended to his new extended family. But certain details, invisible at the time, would later take on different meaning. Larry prided himself on fiscal responsibility. It was central to who he was, the man who taught his kids never to be lazy, never to waste, always to earn. He managed their money carefully, keeping track of every dollar. This was something Lori knew well, and yet there was something Larry didn't know, something that existed in a parallel world hidden from his view, growing larger and more dangerous with each passing month. The day was February 13th, 2018, a Tuesday, the day before Valentine's Day. Larry and Lori had plans. They would take their boat out on Lake Coeur d'Alene before sunrise to watch the dawn break over the water. It was the kind of romantic gesture that fit their public image as devoted partners. After the boat ride, they intended to have a special Valentine's breakfast together. They left their home while it was still dark, the winter cold, sharp and biting. The lake was quiet at that hour, the water dark and calm. They launched the boat and headed out onto the water as the first hints of light began to appear on the horizon. According to Lori's account, everything was normal at first. They were out there together, watching the sky change colors, enjoying the peace of the early morning. Then, she said, something went wrong with the motor. Larry leaned toward it to investigate. He gave her a strange look. She would later mention something about stroke-like symptoms, a sudden change in his demeanor. And then he fell overboard, into the frigid February water. That was her version. What happened next, according to the official timeline, was a gap. A period of approximately 2 hours during which Lori did not call for help. When asked about this later, she explained that she didn't want to leave the area where Larry had fallen, that she was searching, that she was hoping. At approximately 2 hours after the incident, she finally dialed 911. When rescuers arrived, they found Lori with visible injuries, a bloody nose, which she explained came from trying to save her husband. The boat was intact. Larry was nowhere to be found. The water temperature that morning was in the low 40s. In water, that cold survival time without rescue is measured in minutes, not hours. The search for Larry Eisenberg began immediately after the 911 call. Divers entered the frigid lake, and rescue teams scanned the water for any sign of him. Days passed. The community watched and waited. Lori gave interviews, describing her grief, her shock, her devastation at losing her husband in such a sudden, tragic accident. About a week after the incident, Lori wrote a letter to friends and family, describing the morning in emotional detail, the trip to the lake, the accident, her desperate attempts to save him. The narrative she presented was one of a widow in mourning, but beneath the surface, investigators were already troubled. The 2-hour delay before calling 911 didn't sit right. The details of her story seemed to shift slightly with each telling. And then there were the injuries. Lori's bloody nose, which she attributed to rescue efforts, raised questions about what exactly had happened on that boat. On March 1st, 2018, Larry Eisenberg's body was recovered from the lake, about 2.5 weeks after he disappeared. The discovery brought a measure of closure to those who had been waiting and hoping, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase, one that would reveal something no one expected. The autopsy that followed would change everything. When the medical examiner began the examination, they expected to find evidence consistent with drowning. A man in his late 60s falling into frigid water, his body submerged for weeks. The cause of death seemed obvious. But science told a different story. The medical examiner found something unexpected. Larry Eisenberg had not drowned. The cause of death was diphenhydramine toxicity, an overdose of Benadryl, the common antihistamine found in medicine cabinets across America. The concentration in his blood was 7,100 nanograms per milliliter, a level so far above therapeutic doses that it could only have been achieved through massive, deliberate ingestion. To put this in perspective, a normal dose produces blood levels far, far lower than what was found in Larry's system. This was no longer a tragic accident on a cold February morning. This was a homicide investigation. Suddenly, every detail took on new significance. The romantic sunrise trip, the motor problems, the strange look Lori described, the 2-hour delay, the letter to friends and family, carefully crafted to establish a narrative, the bloody nose. And then investigators discovered something else. On the very day Larry disappeared, Lori had been exposed publicly for a completely different crime, one that would provide the missing piece of the puzzle. The double life Lori Eisenberg had been leading for years was about to collapse. As executive director of the North Idaho Housing Coalition, Lori had access to federal funds intended to help low-income families with housing. Over a period of years, she had systematically stolen from this organization, creating false invoices and fake expenses, setting up shell companies in her daughters' names, and siphoning money into her own pockets and those of her children. The total amount she embezzled: over $500,000. 4 of her 6 daughters were implicated. Amber Hosking received approximately $16,500. Jessica Barnes received around $15,500. Tracy Tesh and April Barnes also received stolen funds. All 4 would eventually face federal charges. Larry Eisenberg knew nothing about this. The man who prided himself on fiscal responsibility, who taught his children to be straight arrows, who trusted his wife completely. He had no idea that she had been stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars and that federal investigators were closing in. The exposure was coming. And when Larry found out, his world would shatter. The woman he loved, the community leader he admired, the partner he trusted, she was a thief facing federal prosecution. The financial security he had worked his entire life to build would be threatened by restitution payments and legal fees. His reputation in the community would be tainted by association. Prosecutors would later argue that this impending exposure was the motive for murder. Lori couldn't let Larry discover the truth. She couldn't face the confrontation, the divorce, the complete destruction of the life she had constructed. And so, according to the prosecution's theory, she chose a different path. After Larry's death, Lori continued the deception. The letter to friends and family was part of it, establishing herself as a grieving widow, deflecting suspicion. But investigators found more troubling evidence of planning. Digital forensics revealed something chilling. While Larry and Lori were in Florida on their bucket list trip, someone had been conducting Google searches about drowning, currents, and deep water. The searches were traced to Lori. And there was another detail, small but significant. After Larry's disappearance, one of his friends received a text message that appeared to be from Larry's phone, but something was wrong with it. The message contained an emoji. People who knew Larry well said he never used emojis, ever. Phone records analysis showed that Lori, on the other hand, used them regularly. Then came the will. Investigators discovered handwritten changes to Larry's estate documents, changes that would have shifted 80% of his assets to Lori's 6 daughters, leaving only 20% to Larry's own 2 children, Dean and Jessica. The alterations had not gone through proper legal channels. They appeared to be part of a plan to redirect Larry's wealth after his death. The investigation into Larry Eisenberg's death moved on 2 parallel tracks: the federal embezzlement case and the state homicide investigation. The federal case moved first. Lori was arrested and charged with wire fraud and theft from programs receiving federal funds. The evidence was overwhelming: years of false invoices, fake companies, money trails leading directly to her and her daughters. In 2019, she pleaded guilty to the federal charges and was sentenced to 60 months in federal prison, plus ordered to pay full restitution and fines. But the murder case was more complex. Prosecutors needed to prove not just that Larry had been poisoned, but that Lori was responsible. The evidence, while compelling, was largely circumstantial. The pieces included the 2-hour delay before calling 911, the Google searches about drowning and currents conducted during their Florida trip, the diphenhydramine toxicity that had nothing to do with falling into water, the text message with the emoji sent from Larry's phone, the altered will documents, the timing of the exposure of the embezzlement, and the phone records that showed Larry had complained to his doctor about strange symptoms, shakes, and foggy thinking during their travels. Had Lori been poisoning him gradually, even before the boat trip? The symptoms Larry described to his doctor suggested he might have been ingesting something harmful without his knowledge. In February 2020, exactly 2 years after Larry's death, Lori Eisenberg was charged with first-degree murder. The charging documents cited aggravating factors, including the use of poison and lying in wait or torture. There was one complication, however. Prosecutors acknowledged they could not determine exactly how Larry ingested the fatal dose of diphenhydramine. Was it in his coffee? In food? In a drink on the boat that morning? The mechanism remained unclear. What was clear was that the level of the drug in his system was lethal, and that it hadn't gotten there by accident. The case did not go to a full trial. Instead, in 2021, Lori Eisenberg entered an offered plea to second-degree murder. An offered plea is a specific legal mechanism in which a defendant does not admit guilt but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to likely secure a conviction. It allows for sentencing without a full admission of responsibility, a legal technicality that would later cause significant pain to Larry's family. At the sentencing hearing, Lori spoke. She acknowledged that she was responsible for Larry's death, but her explanation stunned the courtroom. She claimed that she had intended to harm herself that morning, not Larry. She said she had prepared a drink laced with Benadryl for her own consumption, planning to end her own life because she couldn't face the exposure of the embezzlement. According to her account, Larry accidentally drank the poisoned beverage by mistake. The judge did not accept this version of events. Looking at the totality of the evidence, the Google searches, the altered will, the 2-hour delay, the text message with the emoji, the careful letter to friends establishing an accident narrative, the court found Lori's explanation implausible. It simply didn't fit the facts. Larry's family members addressed the court with raw emotion. His daughter Jessica McPherson spoke of the permanent hole in her soul left by her father's death. and the impossibility of finding closure when the person responsible still refused to tell the truth. She described how Lori's offered plea, avoiding a full admission of guilt, felt like salt on the wounds. Even Lori's own stepdaughter, Amber, spoke against her. She testified that Larry had been a wonderful father figure and grandfather to her and her siblings. She told the court that her mother had manipulated the family and that she and her sisters did not support Lori, did not stand by her. Looking back, Amber expressed regret that she hadn't cooperated with investigators earlier, before the full scope of her mother's deception became clear. The sentence was life in prison with a minimum fixed term of 30 years before parole eligibility. Combined with her federal sentence for embezzlement, Lori Eisenberg will not be eligible for release until 2050, when she will be 97 years old. The case had split the family down the middle. Larry's two children lost their father and watched the woman who killed him escape a full murder conviction through a legal maneuver. They sat through hearings and sentencing, carrying grief that had no outlet, facing a woman who wouldn't fully admit what she had done. Lori's 6 daughters were left to reconcile the mother they thought they knew with the woman who had stolen money using their names and then killed her husband to cover her crimes. The woman who had taught them to live right and make good choices had been living a lie for years, drawing them into her schemes, using their identities for fraud. One daughter, Chrislyn Woolston, had posted Lori's $75,000 bail after her arrest, believing in her mother despite the mounting evidence. When Lori later disappeared while out on bail, triggering a manhunt before she was eventually located, Chrislyn was left financially responsible for that bond. She later described the pain of realizing that her mother didn't care if she hurt her own daughter in her attempts to escape accountability. The woman who had raised her, who had taken her to church every Sunday, had abandoned her without a second thought. Another daughter, Amber, spoke publicly about the betrayal. On Dateline, she stated clearly, "We do not support her. We do not stand by her." The words carried the weight of shattered trust, of a mother-daughter bond irreparably broken. Lake Coeur d'Alene is still there, quiet and vast, reflecting the sky the way it did on that February morning in 2018. The water doesn't remember what happened. It just keeps moving, season after season, indifferent to the secrets that sank beneath its surface. Larry Eisenberg's children remember him differently than the headlines do. To them, he wasn't the victim in a murder case. He was the man who taught them about hard work and honesty. He was the father who took them hunting and fishing, who loved his dog Echo with pure, uncomplicated affection. He was someone who crossed items off his bucket list with childlike excitement, watching a rocket launch, riding a fan boat, learning to sail. At 68, Larry believed he had earned a peaceful retirement with a woman he loved. He trusted Lori completely. He had no idea that beneath the surface of their perfect marriage, a different reality was taking shape, one built on theft, deception, and ultimately, betrayal. The case raises questions that extend beyond one family's tragedy. How well do we really know the people closest to us? What secrets can hide behind a familiar smile, a giddy laugh, a reputation for community service? And how does someone go from Community Volunteer of the Year to convicted murderer? There are no easy answers. Lori Eisenberg's path from poverty to nonprofit executive to killer was paved with small deceptions that grew into larger ones, with financial pressures that mounted until they became unbearable, with a willingness to prioritize self-preservation above everything else, including the life of the man who loved her. Lori Eisenberg is currently incarcerated at Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She sits there with the consequences of her choices, while Larry's grandchildren grow up without him, while his children carry an absence that nothing can fill. The Paradise Cabin where the blended family once gathered sits empty of those memories now, its meaning forever changed. Some stories don't have neat endings. Some wounds don't heal with a verdict. But telling these stories matters, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remember the people behind the cases. Larry Eisenberg was more than a crime statistic. He was someone's father, someone's grandfather, someone who believed in doing things the right way. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video. Your support helps bring more cases like this one to light with the depth and respect they deserve. Because behind every headline, there's a human story waiting to be told.